What's up, it's the Tominator here. So in this video, I wanted to show some love to my favorite era, what I believe to be the pinnacle of the sport of bodybuilding, and that is the 1990s. So yeah, this footage you see in the background is just meant to kind of illustrate my points and remind you all how amazing these 90s bodybuilders really were. So this first clip right here is taken from the seminal 1993 Arnold Classic, and later we'll check out one of the greatest non-major bodybuilding shows of all time, the 1996 German Grand Prix. Now, when we talk about the golden era of bodybuilding, what immediately comes to mind for most people is, of course, the 1970s, when you had all those great old school legends like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sergio Oliva, Frank Zane, Lou Ferrigno, Tom Platz, Franco Columbu, etc., just a whole slew of incredible classic icons. So it really was a golden era for bodybuilding, there's no doubt about it. But in my opinion, the 1990s was even better, and it outshines the 70s in several key ways. The first of which, and this is very subjective, but I would hazard to say that the physiques themselves were simply of a higher caliber. I mean, just look at all the quality muscle Vince Taylor's packing right here. You can practically see the individual muscle fibers firing when he's flexing, and it's the finer details like this which are sorely lacking in today's bodybuilding. Now, obviously, some real advances to supplementation and other useful anabolic substances have been made since Arnold's day. And so virtually every bodybuilder on the circuit was able to come in more massive than ever before and with sharper conditioning. Plus, they pretty much all had fantastic leg and back development by this point, which is something you can't necessarily say about the 70s. So overall, I would argue there's no question that 90s bodybuilders were more fully developed and superior from a bodybuilding standpoint when we're talking about foundational things like muscularity, complete development, definition, and so on. But the beautiful thing is that despite carrying all of that extra mass, they rarely ever lost sight of the other side of the equation, and that is the art form that bodybuilding represents. We're talking symmetry, proportions, aesthetics, and presentation. These things were all still top tier. So to me, the 90s kind of represents the best of both worlds. You had a ton of hard, dry muscle mass on hand, but the physiques were still shapely and appealing to look at. Paul Dillette right here perfectly exemplifies this. He was by far the most aesthetic and well-proportioned mass monster to ever play the game. It's just a shame that his subpar posing ability could never quite do his glorious physique justice. But nevertheless, I think that Lee Labrada's moniker actually sums up this era quite nicely, and that is mass with class. That's exactly what you had here, since the 90s was essentially a hybrid of old school and modern day bodybuilding, as you might expect given that it took place right smack dab in the middle of those two eras. Best of all, there were no bubble guts, at least not nearly to the extent of what we see today. The midsections, for the most part, were still streamlined and extremely well defined, and the posing, with a couple of minor exceptions like Dillette here, was arguably just as good as it had ever been. Because they still took time to craft classy, well-choreographed routines, unlike most of the guys today who mainly just strut around the stage, hitting a bunch of front doubles and most musculars over and over, and generally looking like they're just making it up as they go along. Another reason that I loved the 90s so much was because the depth of field was pretty much unsurpassed. You could easily argue that it was the most stacked and competitive era ever, and I would, with Hall of Famers such as Dorian Yates, Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, Sean Ray, Chris Cormier, Vince Taylor, Ronnie Coleman, Nasser El Somebody, Paul Dillette, and Lee Priest all doing battle year after year. Even some of the less heralded names out there were awesome in their own right. Guys like Jean-Pierre Fuchs, Mike Francois, Aaron Baker, Charles Claremont, Mike Matarazzo, Paul DeMaio. These guys would have been some of the elite of their day had they competed in the 80s. Speaking of which, let's add in some holdovers from the 1980s like Lee Labrada, Momo Benaziza, and Lee Haney, the latter of which I don't consider to be a 90s bodybuilder, of course, but he technically did claim his last two Olympias in 1990 and 91. Anyway, you add in all these other names into the mix, and we're talking about an overflowing boatload of top-notch talent here. And I'm not even going to mention the likes of Dexter Jackson, Marcus Rule, Gunter Schlierkamp, and Jay Cutler, who all made their Olympia debuts in the mid to late 90s, because these guys wouldn't really go on to make a name for themselves until the 2000s, so I don't count them as part of this class. But regardless, I don't think any other decade can boast quite such a deep and talented roster as the one I just listed. And finally, the last major reason I regard the 90s in such high esteem is because it really had something for everyone. And what I mean by this is that if you like aesthetic or athletic-looking physiques, you need look no further than the early 1990s. Flex Wheeler, particularly this version you see here in 1993, was the very pinnacle of that aesthetic ideal to myself and many others. But if even this is too muscular or comic book-like for your taste, Then there's other lighter, more natural-looking physiques, you might say. Guys to admire like Lila Brada, Charles Claremont, perhaps a young Sean Ray or Milo Sarchev. On the other hand, if conditioning is the name of the game and you prefer to see all sorts of striated pecs and feathered quads and guys just absolutely peeled to the bone, then look no further than Andreas Munzer, the most ripped bodybuilder in history. This guy was like a walking anatomy chart, okay? Dude even had striations in his back, which is just unheard of. And of course, the shadow, Dorian Yates, was no slouch in this department either. He was always famous for his granite hard conditioning. To my knowledge, he was really the first to consistently bring that ultra-dense type of muscle. And last but not least, if big freaky mass monsters are more your style, then you had that in spades as well. And you can see that right here in the form of Dorian Yates once again, Nasser, Dillette, Coleman, and even Lavroni to a degree in his later years. So really, my point is, you can't go wrong here, guys. No other period in history offered the same variety. The 70s and 80s didn't allow for these extreme levels of conditioned muscularity, and the 2000s and 2010s just didn't retain the same aesthetic appeal. So I think the 90s had something to offer for just about everybody, no matter what your subjective tastes. The only real downside is that this is when it started to go wrong. Now, it hadn't truly happened yet, but you could see the sport beginning its inevitable decline as they kept pushing the envelope and being forced to play the size game. Ever since Dorian blew everyone away in '93 with his unprecedented mass, it became something like an arms race to see who could get the biggest the fastest, which resulted in Ronnie Coleman eventually blowing out his midsection in the early 2000s and giving birth, no pun intended, to the rise of the whole bubble gut epidemic. You could also point the finger at Yates, or more accurately the judges, for controversially allowing him to beat several more balanced and far shapely contenders on a couple of notable occasions, because this also served to steer bodybuilding away from its artistic roots. But still, like I said before, compared to what we see today, even the worst waistline offenders of the 90s were positively statuesque by current standards. The other final blemish to confess is the unfortunate application of synthol, which became fairly prominent by the late 90s. The year 1999, as I recall, was especially egregious, where you had former avatars of aestheticism like Flex Wheeler and Milo Sarchev both utilizing the oily substance to artificially try to boost their weak points in a rather sad and misguided attempt to hang with the true mass monsters like Ronnie Coleman. Let's just say it didn't pan out well for them, it wasn't a good look, and the whole idea of synthol in the first place makes a mockery out of the sport, in my opinion, so it is a rather deplorable stain on an otherwise nearly perfect time in bodybuilding history. So while it certainly wasn't without its flaws, I still strongly maintain that the 90s was the true peak of professional bodybuilding. But hey man, that's all for me. What do you guys think? What was your favorite decade? And let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more if you enjoyed this one. But until next time, guys, I'm the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.